Good evening. My name is Jim Mackin. I'm a resident of 370 Riverside Drive, and we are celebrating our 100th birthday. And this presentation will cover some history of our building. So I welcome all of our residents of 370 Riverside Drive. And I also welcome all my fellow historians in the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. Many of them have helped with information that we'll talk about in this presentation. I'd also especially like to thank Stephanie Azzarone because her recent book, Heaven on the Hudson, which is behind me over here, has become the new definitive history of Riverside Drive and Riverside Park. And also another member of our group, Rob Garber, who's celebrating the 100th anniversary of his building right next to our building. His building is 375 Riverside Drive. And he's been a tremendous help in terms of the history of our buildings and the neighborhood as well. So welcome to them as well. Thanks especially to the Good Neighbor Committee of 370 Riverside Drive that made an arrangement for this presentation to happen the evening before on December 5th to the residents. I'm making a new presentation here just to get a little more precise and maybe make it just a little more clear and focused. To start us off, I'm going to locate us on an early map in New York City. And many people know that in 1811, a commission was set up to create the New York City grid. And Colonel John Randall did the survey work. And coming out of that effort, he produced a number of what we call Randall Farm maps. And they've all been put together into one large map of Manhattan with wonderful detail. And I'm going to focus right in on one of those maps from 1819 that shows where 370 Riverside Drive will eventually get constructed. Here's the map. You could see names like 11th Avenue, even 12th Avenue over here, which never got built, but in a simple sense became kind of like Riverside Drive. And here's 110th Street. You could see that name here. And here's 109th Street. So the building 370 Riverside Drive will eventually get built here. Riverside Drive, the road hasn't been built yet as of 1819 and wouldn't get built till later in the 1880s. But this is where our building would have been. This just zooms in on it, so it gives you more perspective. Again, 370 Riverside Drive would be on this site. And in time, Riverside Drive would get built where I'm taking the cursor here. But let's jump ahead to 1867. This has some wonderful detail that'll help us understand the neighborhood history a little bit more. This large green area was the Leake and Watts Orphan Asylum, which over time got sold to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, the Episcopal diocese in the area. Curiously enough, part of that building is still on the site. You can walk into the cathedral grounds, the cathedral close, and see part of the old Leake and Watts Orphanage building from 1843. You won't be able to see, and this map shows it, a little burying ground. One of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members, Pam Tice, discovered this one day, and we're still trying to research what it's all about, but we suspect it might have been connected with the orphan asylum. You could see the Bloomingdale Road, which was on our previous Randall map of 1819. Here's the Bloomingdale Road kind of running up the west side. And here's a little side lane that got you closer to the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum, which is up here. And some of these other lines are simply property lines. Some of the people that owned property at the time were people like Nicholas DePeyster. The DePeysters married into the Leake and Watts family. Let's see the name John Jacob Astor. Most people know that Astor was a investor in a lot of Manhattan real estate and did very well by that. And then our local owner was Gordon S. Mumford. Not much is known about Mumford, but he certainly had property in the area. So I'll zoom in again to show you that Here's 110th Street, or today Cathedral Parkway. Here's 109th Street. Here's the Bloomingdale Road. And our building, 370 Riverside Drive, would be approximately here. Riverside Drive hadn't yet been built. I keep stressing that, but look at the proximity to the Hudson River down here. And running along the Hudson River was the old New York Central Railroad tracks. But let's jump ahead to 1889. In 1889, we start to see more development in the area. Here's 109th Street. Here's the Bloomingdale Road. Here's 110th Street. There's a number of small structures along 110th Street and also along the west side of Broadway here, but nothing where 370 Riverside Drive is going to get built. And here too, I'll zoom in so you can get a better perspective on it. This would be where 370 Riverside Drive is going to get built. So we see lots of detail here, but none of these buildings will be familiar to anyone living today because they're not there. If I go ahead just 2 years, and before I do that, I just want to give you this sense of the landscape in the area. This is a wonderful photograph that conveys how the landscape looked. And this is just 1 year later in 1890. This is looking southwest from the corner of Weston Avenue and 106th Street. And again, I show this just to show the amount of rocky outcroppings, open fields. So this is 106th Street here. And over here runs West End Avenue, which for many years was simply called 11th Avenue. And this farmhouse here was a holdover from colonial times, was actually the start of the skirmishes that got to be called the Battle of Harlem Heights. This was in colonial times, a buckwheat field, and that's where the Battle of Harlem Heights officially began. Nicholas Jones was an early colonial that had a farmhouse here and a farm. So the 2 years later I'm alluding to is 1891, and to put this in large perspective, between 113th Street and 120th Street, we have the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum. Columbia occupies all of this property today. In fact, the Bloomingdale Insane Asylum moved off of this property around 1892 up to White Plains, and their brand new building there from 1892-93 still exists, and you could see that, and it's actually on Bloomingdale Road in White Plains. And very curiously, coincidentally, right down the block is a Bloomingdale's department store, but that's just total coincidence. Here too, if I zoom in, here's our Bloomingdale Road again. Here's the property where 370 Riverside Drive would be. And we still see all of these low-level buildings along 110th Street and the west side of Broadway. So what happens in the next few years is the area does start to get built up very, very quickly. Most of us know this building, the Bona Vista. No one uses that name anymore. Everyone knows it as a Columbia dorm, built in 1904. It's on Riverside Drive. Here's 109th Street. Here's Riverside Drive. And over here is now, or in current times, another tall apartment building called the Rutherford. But in this time period, 1904, there was a Samuel Bain mansion. So I call your attention to this building in a couple of respects. One, it's got the wonderful original classical cornice overhanging the building. It's got an entrance marquee down here. We'll get a better view of that in a subsequent photo. And it's got lots of awnings on the building before air conditioning comes into usage. Awnings were a simple way just to get shade and deal with oppressive heat during the summers. The other building that most of us in 370 Riverside Drive are familiar with is called today the Riverside Inn, but in its day it had the fancy name of Pontchartrain. Pontchartrain is the lake just north of New Orleans. So this building gets romanticized. Again, it has a wonderful cornice at the top, built in 1906. I apologize for this minor typo up here, but you can see that it is 109th Street. And as I jump ahead to 1916, I can point out again that, again, here's the Bloomingdale Road, which you can see kind of came off of the modern Broadway. And here's where 370 Riverside Drive would get built, but it's not here yet, nor is 375, which would be here, nor is 610 Cathedral Parkway, which would get built here. But some interesting things, we zoom in again, and you could see some buildings are getting larger buildings. This is an 8-story apartment building getting built on the northwest corner of 109th and Broadway here. And another commercial building here got built on the 110th Street or the Cathedral Parkway corner. But again, 370 Riverside Drive as of 1916 wasn't built yet. But the Riverside Drive service road was built. Incidentally, Riverside Drive was known as Riverside Avenue from its earliest iteration up to about 1909. And just to put the Bloomingdale Road to rest, around 1867 or 68, the Bloomingdale Road got abandoned and replaced by, we know it today as Broadway, but as of that time period, 1867, it was called the Boulevard, or sometimes the Grand Boulevard. It had a wonderful park running through it. And this is before the IRT subway came in 1904. So here's a view of this Bona Vista Hotel, today a Columbia Dome. There's that wonderful classical cornice at the top. I pointed out the entrance marquee. Here's an interesting or good picture of it. This is the Heinrich Hudson, which is 380 Riverside Drive on the north side of Cathedral Parkway, 110th Street. You can see these old Model T period cars. There's one here, there's one here. Here's Riverside Drive as we know it. And here's the service road to Riverside Drive. And one of the geniuses of Olmsted's design for Riverside Drive and Riverside Park was creating the park in between the service road and the drive itself. Again, Stephanie Ezerone's book on this, Heaven on the Hudson, has wonderful detail with all of that. Let me try to interest you with a few more photographs from that period. In 1920, this is a picture looking southeast from about Cathedral Parkway here, and here's the Riverside Drive service road. Here's that Buena Vista building again, today the Columbia Dome. Here's that Pontchartrain again, today the Riverside Inn. Here's the Manhasset apartment building, landmark building. And the site's getting prepared as of 1920 for the building of 375 and 370 over here. On the top of 610 Cathedral Parkway, believe it or not, and this is an image from about 1920, there was an outdoor theater, and it was called the Moorish Gardens, thanks to our friend Rob Garber and my fellow historian in the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. We get a little more detail on the history here. This theater from 1913 to 1920 or so, they showed outdoor movies. It was called the Moorish Gardens, and it sat or entertained about 1,500 to 2,000 people. This is all outdoors. Of course, there's the silent movie area. A pianist would be seated near the screen and play while the movies were shown. And I always love to point out, in our neighborhood, most all of the movie moguls that founded MGM, Universal, United Artists, Paramount, they all came from our neighborhood, most all of them. William Fox, the namesake of 20th Century Fox and subsequently Fox News, even though he wasn't directly involved in those, he also grew up in our neighborhood. In 1918, this site was going to be the venue for a follow-up to the Armory Show for the downtown that introduced all of America to modern art. The Society for Independent Artists, including, and what would happen soon, Marcel Duchamp famously submitted a urinal the year before to be shown, but for reasons that required a larger venue, they wound up having the exhibition down on 42nd Street instead of this site right here. In 1921, we show this image because now you see 370 Riverside Drive right here, and you also see 375 Riverside Drive right here, and you also see 610 Cathedral Parkway. And even this building, which had a name on subsequent maps, the Edgerton, is still extant today, 309 West 109th Street. So the entire block is fully developed, but not technically as of 1921. I think the map just incorporated the plans. The actual buildings, 370 and 375 Riverside Drive, both got built the following year, 1922. Here's an image of 375 Riverside Drive, the year it got built. And I'm not sure, I'm confident that this shows that 370 Riverside Drive, which would have been here, hadn't yet gotten built. But this is a wonderful photograph of 375. Here's a modern photograph of 370 Riverside Drive. This 1922 date just refers to the year that it got built. You could see it's a much more modern photograph. The people that designed 370 Riverside Drive are Simon Schwartz and Arthur Gross. We architectural historians in the neighborhood know them as Schwartz and Gross. And indeed, 370 Riverside Drive, from an architectural standpoint, is in really great company. If you know 55 Central Park West, it's where they filmed Ghostbusters, but it's a spectacular building in and of itself for reasons I'll save for some other time. The same thing with 336 Central Park West. It's Egyptian Art Deco. There aren't many Egyptian Art Deco buildings in the entire city. Spectacular brickwork. If you're there on 93rd Street in Central Park West, take a look up at the top of the building. It's fabulous. 924 West End Avenue, which is the Cleburne most people know on 105th Street. It replaced the mansion farmhouse that the Strauss family, Isidore Strauss, lived in, the namesake of Strauss Park. It's a building that has a porte cochere, and there's a number of notable people that even today live in that building. That was a Schwartz and Gross building. And if you're ever on 99th Street between Riverside Drive and West End Avenue, please remember to look at 309. It's a spectacular old building, and the cornice is still intact. Schwartz and Gross also did the two preeminent buildings in Harlem, 409 and 555 Edgecombe Avenue. And so many notable African Americans lived in those two buildings: Count Basie, Joe Louis, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall. And even when Babe Ruth first came to New York City from Boston, he lived in 409 Edgecombe. They also did 800 Riverside Drive. That's at the top end of Riverside Drive at 158th Street. Spectacular building, the Grinnell. Grinnell, the name and family is connected with John James Audubon. And it's triangular, and it has an interior triangular courtyard. It's just a masterpiece. Our good friend Matthew Spady, who wrote a book about Audubon Park up in that neighborhood, lives in the Grinnell and has lectured extensively, and his book about the area covers all of that. And Schwartz and Gross also did 404 Riverside Drive, which many people know as the Strathmore. It's where the streaming show Mrs. Maisel takes place, and much, much else. The movie Billy Bathgate, many other TV shows and movies. And he also did 440 Riverside Drive, which is known as the Paterno. That's on the north side of 116th Street at Riverside Drive. And that very name Paterno gives me a reason to segue into maybe some larger architectural history in our area, because the Paterno family developed more buildings in our large neighborhood than anybody else. And they employed architects like Schwartz and Gross, and Gaetano, who did 375 Riverside Drive and a number of other spectacular buildings, and various other architects, not all well known, but the Paternos created a venue for them to make themselves known, at least to all of us that appreciate the architecture in our area. Here's a picture from 1927 from the air. The Fairchild people that connected with aviation took photographs from above. And here you could see that's 370 Riverside Drive. That's 375 Riverside Drive. This is that Buena Vista, today a Columbia Dome. That's the Rutherford. We can go on and on and on. You'll notice the entire area is developed. There's a couple of plots that are still not developed, like this one on the north side of 111th Street. But for the most part, this area gets very, very concentrated by this time period. So 370 Riverside Drive starts to look for tenants in 1922. And here's an ad in the paper that tells you a little bit about what you might expect: 5 rooms and 2 baths, or a 6-room and 3 baths. Having living in the building, I could tell you that this is more properly called a classic 6, which really means 2 full baths and a half bath shower. It's a very tiny bathtub, but whatever. We're one of the few buildings on the Upper West Side that hasn't broken down into smaller apartments, which happened with many buildings in later years. There's another ad which just has a nice image of our building. And this is from the Light and Power Company that supplied electricity to the building, something we take for granted today, but in those days it had to be specifically planned for. We have a 1924 voting list out of Ancestry.com records. So we know most of the people that we hear from the get-go, not always all the people. And you could see quite a number of people here. Again, my friend Rod Garber at 375 Riverside Drive pointed out that there were 4 people with an address of 371 Riverside Drive. How could that be? Well, we don't know for sure. I've got to compare that to the 1925 census and see if that gives some kind of insight. Then the newspapers start to cover a whole bunch of interesting things over the years. This is a very early, there are a couple of articles in different papers about a resident of the building, Guido Ciccolini. He was a friend of Enrico Caruso. In fact, he named his 3rd daughter, Gloria, after the daughter of Enrico Caruso. And Guido Ciccolini was recorded by Edison. If you go to YouTube and you put in Guido Ciccolini, you'll wind up hearing some of the early Edison cylinders that got recorded with Ciccolini singing as a tenor. There's part of Metropolitan Opera. One other footnote to him was that he had a ticket to be on the Titanic on its maiden voyage from England to the United States, but he couldn't take advantage of being on the Titanic because he had some scheduling conflicts. There's all sorts of other cute stories from different time periods. Here's one about just unfortunately a holdup up on the penthouse. Detailed stories about it, details about what happened. Another one where a resident from the building and a woman and a gentleman from a different building wind up going into the precinct on 100th Street, and big convoluted love triangle type story. And they basically just get set out and say, just keep apart, don't talk to each other. Another one in 1935 about a resident by the name of John Strachey. He had a much longer name, Leighton John St. Clovis Strachey. And he was accused of being a communist. At most, he was probably a progressive, maybe might have even been a member of the Communist Party or the Socialist Party, but he wasn't really a profound communist in his day, but he got accused and kind of laughs it off. And he goes back to England, where he came from, and he gets elected to Parliament. He's actually a member of Parliament. It turns out he's a cousin of Leighton Strachey, who's a well-known writer from that period in England, one of the founders of the Bloomsbury Group, along with Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster, John Maynard Keynes, and his cousin, Leighton Strachey. That was the fellow we were just talking about. There's another series of articles over the years about people that either took their lives by jumping off the building or committed suicide. I absolutely don't want to dwell on that, but there's a fair number of stories, and fortunately, we don't see much more of that. In 1934, and there were a series of articles about this fellow who lived in the building. He was involved in different aspects of government, and finally gets appointed superintendent of state banking, a fairly responsible position, and then gets jailed, gets sent to Sing Sing for bribery and some other nefarious things with the finances. And here he is laughingly posing in front of the building. See the residents in the building, you can see that brickwork you'll be very familiar with. And he was able to get himself paroled out. So I'll try to give a little simple chronology, but I don't have all the pieces. The Paterno brothers that I talked about, they organized something called 370 Riverside Drive Corporation. And they selected one of their workers who handled buildings and construction and whatnot. He was made officially president of the 370 Riverside Drive Corporation to get the project underway. And I might mention with the Paterno brothers, they're more ubiquitous than you might think. They have a large presence in our neighborhood vis-a-vis all the buildings they've built. If you walk down West End Avenue on the cartouche above a lot of building entrances, you'll see the monikers JP, and that stands for Joseph Paterno. If you're up in the northern end of Washington Heights, a little bit past Washington Park, you'll see a monument to the Paterno brothers. If you go to Columbia's campus on Amsterdam Avenue, there's something called Casa Italiana, an entire standalone building, and that was all donated and created by the Paterno brothers. Their father was building a building on either 111th or 112th Street, just west of Amsterdam Avenue, and he died unexpectedly. And one of his sons, I think it was Michael Paterno, dropped out of medical school just to complete the building. And then the sons realized that they could be very, very good at making buildings happen. And so that's what they did. So they had a tremendous impact on our neighborhood, and they certainly helped along the careers of some of these lesser known architects. So in 1922, Schwartz and Gross designed the building. In 1922, 370 is built. Sometime between 1922 and 1944, the ownership passed from the 370 Riverside Drive Corporation to the Glenmere Corporation, which was owned by Robert Wilson Golay. The Golays are an old New York City family, Huguenots, married into the Elbridge Gerry family and the Livingston family. The Golays famously owned Gardiner's Island out on the eastern end of Long Island. In recent times, one of the Golays, I think, was the last president of the New York Historical Society in the 1950s or 60s. Very, very prominent, and they were simply real estate. Golay was simply a real estate investor. Up in Ulster County, he built a mansion called Glenmere because it's on the side of Glenmere Lake. This is near Florida or Goshen. And that's where the name Glenmere Corporation comes. So they owned 370 for a while. I don't know how long. And then in 1944, a fellow named Pasquale Ferry acquired the building from the Glenmere Corporation. And it turns out he was the manager of the Lion Brewery. And the Lion Brewery, which existed from the 1850s all the way up to the 1940s, which means it went through the Prohibition period and it went through subsequent Depression period, was the largest employer in our neighborhood ever, if we don't include Columbia, if we don't extend up into Morningside Heights. So Pascal Ferry was the actual manager of this, and we can only surmise that he had enough money to purchase 370 Riverside Drive. He lived out in Queens, and he turned over his investment within the year. So within the year, another well-known real estate investor, Samuel Nepper, acquired 370 Riverside Drive. And then sometime after that, I'm not sure when, a fellow, Samuel Broxmeyer, acquired 375. And Broxmeyer was in the news all the time for all sorts of nefarious stuff, eventually kiting checks and whatnot. And he actually gets convicted, and he has to go through an involuntary bankruptcy. And by doing that, another company in 1949, HB Management, acquired 370 Riverside Drive. You could see there's a lot of turnover, but there's a lot of property investing transactions and people. Somehow the estate of Joseph Ross, whatever that is, I haven't found out anything, acquired the building. And then the very next year, something called Adjacent Realty acquired the building from the estate of Joseph Ross. By then, at least, we know it's rent control. Rent controllership, as many of you might know, happened after World War II. They were so concerned when soldiers coming back from the war would create so much pricing on rentals that they started to cap them. And then in 1973, the Katz organization, the Simon Katz, Curtis Katz, a couple other Katzes, they become experts. They are real estate investors, to be sure, but they become specialized in doing co-op conversions. And that's where you take a building that's primarily rental and you convince enough renters to buy into a co-op so they can get the benefit of tax deductions and home ownership, equitable ownership. And that's what they do. One of the Katzes, Curtis Katz, who lived in 370 Riverside Drive, actually lived in an apartment 15A, very controversial, as you could see from this article later on in 1981, where he supposedly strong-armed someone in 375 to get them to either move out of their apartment or buy into the co-op. But I don't want to judge him just based on the few articles I've read. He was a very imposing gentleman. He was 6'8". He was one tough cookie, and he was involved with a couple of other co-op conversions on the Upper West Side. We know in our building, all of us that buy into our co-op at 370 Riverside Drive get a package of papers to sign to become equitable owners of shares in 370 Riverside Drive, and to sign leases, because we in effect own shares in the building, but then we just lease our apartments. And in the co-op papers of 1973, these are the people that are still in our building. Having said that, I'm not sure about 8A here, because those people have not been in the apartment for a few years now, but they still seem to be the owners of it. But all of these other people, us residents of 370 Riverside Drive, would know most of them by name and by sight. Here's a tax photo of 370 Riverside Drive in 1940. I show this because there's so few full photographs of the building over the years, but one subtlety here is kind of neat, and it's this fence. Those of us that walk dogs over here, or even walk on the sidewalk on Riverside Drive on the service road there, we look to a chain link fence, a shoddy chain link fence. But in 1940, there was a rather elegant fence here. So I point that out just to take advantage of that. One other thing I'll give some attention to is on the southeast corner of Cathedral Parkway and Broadway. You can see one of the double-decker buses, famously down Riverside Drive, and this is probably the precursor to the M4. There's some double-decker buses, but on that southeast corner of Cathedral Parkway and Broadway, here's Broadway, and here's Cathedral Parkway, 110th Street, was a movie theater, the Nemo. The Nemo, as I point out on the right here, was previously the Lion Beer Garden associated with that Lion Brewery. In fact, it was the favorite hangout of Columbia students when Columbia moved up here from 49th Street between Madison and Park to where they are today in Morningside Heights. The students favored the Lion Beer Garden before they discovered the West End Cafe years later. But the movie theater was built on some of the structure of the Lion Beer Garden, and that opened in 1919. 1926, the William Fox organization acquired the theater, and the theater operated for years and years. Here it is operating as of the 1940 tax photo period, and it didn't get demolished till 1963. It was closed, and then it became a supermarket. Many of us remember Gristedes, which was the final iteration of the supermarket. Then that got demolished, and then Columbia built the taller building with the school there. So in this 1956 map, we can just recap some of this stuff. By now, there's a subway station up here. Here's 370 Riverside Drive. The entire block is built up. Here's the Nemo Theater, still there in 1956. There's some kind of restaurant right next to it. Michael Sukin in this building, 370 Riverside Drive, pointed out that Zabar's had a presence on the northeast corner of Cathedral Parkway and Broadway, where West Side Market is today, right up here. And indeed, we found that to be the case. So thank you, Michael. And all of these other buildings are here. We referenced the Pontchartrain, which got built in 1906, the Buena Vista, which was built in 1904, et cetera, et cetera. Many of us will know the Manchester. There's a Manchester diner down at street level. The Buena Vista, which today is that Columbia Dorm, actually had its own garage over here. That's now a playground that's completely dedicated to PS 165 down the street here. So, interesting detail. My book, which is on the lower right-hand side here, has 5 people from 370 Riverside Drive, 5 notables. My book has 591 notables in total in our large area between 92nd Street and 125th Street, and between Central Park and Riverside Park, and between Morningside Park and Riverside Park. So if you want to know more about all the famous people that lived in our neighborhood, get your hands on my book. You probably recognize people like Yul Brynner, Billie Holiday, Woody Guthrie, Barack Obama, Amelia Earhart, Maya Angelou. I won't go through all of them, but we have some real heavy hitters in our neighborhood. Each of these people is very important. Hannah Arendt, the political theorist. If you haven't seen the movie Hannah Arendt, that's worth looking at. The director of that movie, Margarita von Trotta, contacted us through an old resident of the building, Joanna and Bill Herman, and Joanna Herman's friend turned out to be an assistant on the movie, and they were good enough to go up to the apartment 12A, thanks to our residents up there, Selena and Jack. And with that, they just got a feel of the apartment to put into the movie. This woman, Grace Chu, is the person who popularized fine Chinese cooking in America. Martin Gutzwiller, many of us in the building knew him personally. Renowned physicist at IBM and various other places. He is the Gutzwiller approximation. You could Google him or read in my book. I was sitting in Riverside Park once when he told me a great story about him driving Robert Oppenheimer up Riverside Drive. Henry Pfeiffer, pharmaceutical executive, his pharmaceutical company became Warner Lambert, which in turn got acquired by an even larger pharmaceutical company. And Robert G. Thompson, who again is in my book, you'll read about how he was both a communist leader and a World War II hero. on our side. So some really great stories. Hannah Arendt, we will soon have a plaque on our building. I won't go into more detail because it's being worked out as we speak, but that's a great kudo to one of our residents, Glenn Liner, who's been working with the plaque people and our board, and Glenn are working on the details of how that's going to unfurl. I have a website, notablenewyorkers.com, which has all the notables that are not in my book. And I've got about 20 in our building, 370 Riverside Drive. And over here, I've just selected 5 to point out. Lawrence Blockman, a mystery writer. You could still find his books in good mystery bookstores. Here's that John Strachey I mentioned, who was accused of being a communist, and who went back to England and became a member of parliament. We had one state senator in the building. Very few people will remember that name. I certainly don't. But Norman Mills Price, he was the primary illustrator in classic books, meaning the Treasure Islands and the Charles Dickens books. All of them had illustrations in them in their finest editions, and he did many of them. And then Clarence LaBelle, he general inventor, but I think his primary invention was the electronic stethoscope. So congratulations to all of us that have celebrated our 100 years. And I'll mention and here's a picture of all of us out in front of the building. I'll mention also that plans are underway for us to put together a time capsule where we'll gather stuff from today and put it in a capsule and probably bury it. We haven't figured it out yet, somewhere in the basement of the building. But I thank you for all of your attention. I thank all of the people that have contributed to this and who continue to support the efforts of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. If you want to know more about the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, go to upperwestsidehistory.org or just Google Bloomingdale and history, and that'll get you right there. You can also Google my name, Jim Mackin, and put in Bloomingdale or Upper West Side history, and you'll get to it. The website has some real pleasant surprises on it. Every building between 96th Street and 110th Street is listed, and there's about 1,100 buildings. We found the architects and the year the buildings got built for all of them, except for about 30 some odd. So we've got that. We've got a plethora of articles about history in the neighborhood. And the website also tells you when we do our next monthly walking tour of the neighborhood and our upcoming presentations. We try to do a presentation every month. So again, thank you for your attention to this detail. And I hope you found this useful. Thank you.